The Chancellor's facing pressure to cut taxes, but as former Deputy Director of the IMF, Mohamed El Arian, has told LBC, it could prove counterproductive.
If you want to cut taxes, you've got to come up with what expenditures you're going to cut. And our public services are already running under enormous pressure. There isn't room there.
A potentially key witness has been traced in connection with the disappearance of Nicola Bully. Officers in Lancashire put out an appeal suggesting a fellow dog walker may have seen something before the mother of two went missing on Friday. Thousands of ambulance workers across 5 regions in England and environmental agency workers have announced walkouts for next week. Union members are striking over pay and conditions. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 13 points at 77.71. The pound buys $1.23 and €1.13. LBC weather, heavy showers in the north overnight, dry in the south with lows of 2. More rain tomorrow for southern parts with a high of 10 Celsius. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Charlotte Morgan.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, very good evening. It's 8 on LBC. Welcome to Cross Question. Let me just remind you, if you ever miss an episode of Cross Question, you can catch up on the Cross Question podcast on Global Player. Today we have, to my left, Dr. Mary Bousted on the panel. It's quite timely that she's on the panel because, of course, teachers in England and Wales are going on strike tomorrow and on Friday. She's Joint Secretary of the National Education Union. Sitting next to her is Alicia Kearns, Conservative MP for Rutland and Melton and Chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. On my right, it's Rebecca Long-Bailey, Labour MP for Salford and Eccles and former Shadow Business Secretary. And next to her is Emma Jones, founder of Enterprise Nation, which is a platform providing expert advice and support to small businesses. Now, huge amount going on in the world, which you may want to ask them about. Teachers' strikes, I think the first question is on those, especially for you, Mary. We've obviously arranged it. News on the Hillsborough disaster today, where the police have admitted that they failed on the day of the disaster and in the aftermath. The UK and US saying they won't be sending any fighter jets to Ukraine. I'm sure Alicia Kearns will have a view on that. And Matt Hancock saying that his I'm a Celebrity appearance wasn't primarily about money after he donated £10,000 of his £320,000 fee to charity. Well done him. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to ask our panel a question. You can text 84850 and you can say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC and submit your question that way. And of course you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, welcome to you all. Let's go to our first caller. It's Vicky in Hounslow. Vicky, hello. What would you like to ask?
Hi, Ian. Hi, panel. I just wanted to clarify something. Obviously, you've heard a lot about the strikes that have been going on, and in the midst of that, the wages and benefits that MPs have been receiving at different points in time. So just as the first question, is the government's refusal to discuss pay rates during these negotiations with the strikers a result of ministers simply not valuing these professions and what they do for us, our community, enough?
You seem to be saying they're not discussing pay increases during the negotiations. What's the point, Mary Bousted, of having negotiations if pay increases aren't being discussed? I mean, you've been in the meetings. Presumably they must be.
Well, they're not really, no.
What do you sit there and talk about then?
Well, we try to talk about pay, and we try to say we've got a trade dispute with the Secretary of State, which is about pay this year. That can be resolved in a number of ways. It can be with a greater pay award this year. We could be looking at a longer-term solution for a longer-term correction for teachers' pay. In Wales, the Welsh Government, it's insufficient, but they've offered an amount, an unconsolidated amount just for this year. That's not sufficient, but it's the beginning of a negotiation. Unfortunately, what we get when we go into the department, we've been in for 3 meetings now, 2 lasting an hour, 1 lasting half an hour. That's not a negotiating meeting because you don't...
But what happens? I mean, you're sitting one side of the table. Gillian Keegan, the Education Secretary, is with her officials on the other side. I mean, what happens?
So we say we have a trade dispute with you. We would like proper negotiations. We would like to find a way of getting through this dispute to a resolution. the Secretary of State says that she's not able to offer any more money, that the government's objective is to halve inflation, and that really the problem is workload, and that the only solution she can think about more pay is to pay teachers different rates. Teaching the shortage subjects pay a higher rate. That's not acceptable, and indeed 14 out of 17 secondary subjects are shortage subjects. The government missed its teacher training targets by 41% for secondary this year. All primary is now a shortage subject. It's missed its primary targets for the first time in forever. So the only teachers you wouldn't be paying more money to are dance, drama, classics and history. All the rest are shortage subjects. So we've been in for 2.5 hours to say we want negotiations, we want to find a way ahead for this. We are trained negotiators, it's what I've done for many years. We want to find a solution to this problem. We keep being told, well, there isn't any money this year, and indeed we've got to look at inflation, and very little said about future years. Now, at the last meeting, we did get a commitment to have some negotiation with ministers and civil servants. That's the first time we had that commitment. The problem is, I think, that ministers in different departments have their hands tied by the Treasury. I think the Treasury is blocking any negotiations and saying that this has to be done by an independent pay review body, which isn't independent. The government appoints the panel for the pay review body. The government says which is affordable, and the government has the right to refuse to accept the recommendations of the pay review body. So we have lost faith in that. They generally do
accept them, though.
Yeah. Oh, no. Well, there has been, about 4 years ago, they weren't accepted. And the end result of the pay review body is that let's take CPI inflation rather than RPI inflation, because I know that I'll get my neck jumped down if I do that. Teachers have seen one of the steepest declines of the public sector, 13% cut in real terms in their pay since 2010. So
nurses are 20%.
Well, no, actually, nurses were about the same. It depends on which measure of inflation.
So they calculate it on RPI.
Yeah, that's right. Right. So there is. So I'm now just trying to stick to CPI so that we don't have that argument. Although RPI is fine for calculating mortgage costs and student loan repayments, and has been the measure which has been used by the pay review bodies and by the government for years. Suddenly it's not okay. So let's just take CPI. And the problem is that the other thing the government refuses to accept is we're having a workforce crisis in schools. So Amanda Spillman, the Chief Inspector of Schools, has said that schools are suffering from a workforce crisis because of an exodus of teachers, because they're not recruiting and because they can't recruit support staff. And she says she said in her annual report in December 2022, children and young people are bearing the brunt of a workforce crisis. They're not getting the special educational help that they need. And in too many schools, teachers are teaching out of their subject area. That's happening on an industrial scale now. Rishi Sunak says
that's always happened.
Well, it's much worse now.
I can remember it happened when I was at school.
It's much, yes, but it's much worse now. 500,000 children regularly being taught by teachers who are not qualified in the subject they're teaching, and that's getting worse. So we do need to discuss all these things. But actually, the trade dispute is about pay, and this government has to come to the table and begin negotiations with serious negotiators, because we hope that tomorrow's day of strike action will be the last day of strike action. The next strike isn't until February the 28th. That's Friday. 27 days.
I thought it was Wednesday and Friday.
No, we've got one on the 1st of February.
Right.
And then there's a strike in Wales on the 15th of February. Right. Then the next strike is in the North West on the 28th.
So, Alicia Kearns, what's your solution?
Look, I don't think there is a straightforward solution. If there was, you'd be seeing it being put forward. This is the highest pay award for teachers in 30 years. And
inflation's higher than it's ever been.
No, it is, but there's also such thing as a
7% cut with inflation.
Forgive me, I let you speak, and you said that people were going to jump down your throat. No one did. So the fact is there is such a thing as a wage price spiral. That is something we have to be completely aware of. It's really frustrating because the independent pay body, there is a reason why we have an independent pay body. Labour have not said that they would challenge or question it. The Shadow Chancellor has said that of course they wouldn't challenge the independent pay body. There's a reason why it exists, to take the politics out of these things. Look, it is really difficult. And of course, I think if there was easy solutions, we'd want to give them. But there is also the reality that when Gillian Keegan came as Education Secretary, she had a letter from the unions and they said, we've got one major ask of you. We want more money. And in the autumn statement, she delivered $2 billion more for education this year and $2 billion more for education next year. That was the ask. She delivered it. 5% pay rise now. That's the highest ever. on record that's ever been given, and the average classroom teacher is now on £39,000 a year. Now, that doesn't mean there are some on less, and we need to look at that if there are urgent needs and priorities, but I think it is very difficult. We're not sitting here in some situation where there is money just hanging around waiting for us to find. It is a real challenge.
But in the end, disputes have to be resolved. Otherwise, children's education is going to be dramatically affected. I was told a statistic the other day by somebody, and I assume it's true, that if you're taking a GCSE this year, you've only had 1 year of uninterrupted education, either because of COVID or strikes or whatever. Now, that is a public scandal, and I mean, we can attribute blame to who we like, but it's that famous phrase, you got to think of the children, they're the ones that are being affected here. So if Mary, I suspect, is probably right, that the Treasury, as usual, are the roadblock here, and that I don't expect Mary expects to get 12% or 15% or whatever, but there will have to be some sort of compromise at some point, won't there?
Look, obviously there is an openness for compromise, or else there wouldn't be discussions, there wouldn't be meetings taking place. But the reality is, where is that solution? With the nurses' strikes, look, the SNP in Scotland offered 9% with improved pay, with improved conditions, with additional annual leave, and that wasn't accepted. There is a fundamental point here that children shouldn't be out of education. I'm very grateful to all the teachers who've been making sure that schools stay open as much as possible. I want kids in a safe place. We learned from the pandemic we should never shut schools again. It's a shame that we did. If we'd listened to the union, schools would have stayed shut a lot longer. Kids would have been wearing masks in classrooms. We do have to push back sometimes against things we hear. And also, the other point I quickly make, Ian, was that my mum was a head teacher, and in 2004 she launched a campaign against the then Labour government because there was a school funding crisis. And The Guardian had its front page saying, why does the government keep denying the school funding crisis? As you said, these things do happen. They're cyclical. We're in a desperate situation. The fact is, this is the biggest pay reward for 30 years. Rebecca
Long-Bailey, how would you bring this dispute to a close?
I think it starts with negotiation. I think you've got to recognise that key workers like teachers, ambulance drivers, nurses, postal workers, rail workers, the list is endless. They're going on strike because they're exemplifying that there is a crisis in their sector. It's not just about pay, unfortunately. Pay has eroded over the years, but it's also an issue about safety in those particular sectors. Now, the government has responded to this by being quite hostile. Indeed, instead of negotiating, they brought forward a bill last night in Parliament called the Minimum Service Levels Bill, I should say, which effectively extinguishes the right for key workers to strike.
No, it doesn't.
Well, it does,
That's
because it gives the Secretary of State authoritarian sweeping powers to determine which levels of service should be provided in which sectors, even though key sectors already provide life and limb cover in strike situations as it is. There was no need for this piece of legislation. And any worker...
To be fair, we had Matt Rackon from the Fire Brigades Union last night who made clear that unless there was some major terror incident, his members would be out on strike for... if I had a house fire on that day, there would be no one to come. So, you can understand why the government want minimum service levels in some sectors.
No, I'm sure the fire services, in the same way that the ambulance workers and nurses come to an agreement locally about the level of services they will provide to make sure that there is life and limb cover. Now, what the Minimum Services Bill does effectively allows an employer, a public body, the Secretary of State, to sack a worker if they go on strike against the Secretary of State's direction at that particular time. And that's completely unacceptable. What the government should be doing, instead of creating a hostile environment for key workers, they should be sitting down and listening to their concerns, because, as I said, it's not just about pay. This is about the future and safety of these critical sectors.
I understand that, and in many sectors you're absolutely right. But in the education sector, what pay rise, if you were Secretary of State for Education now, what do you think is a reasonable pay rise?
I think you've got to listen to the needs of teachers and teaching assistants and school staff who are asking for, at the very least, an inflationary pay rise to pay their household costs and their bills. They're struggling. We're in a situation where we've got school staff now who are having to rely on food banks. I've been talking to schools in my own constituency who say they're struggling to recruit, which is the point that Mary made. And in some cases, teaching assistants are offered so much more in the private sector, working in the likes of Amazon warehouses, that they're leaving schools in droves. We've got a real crisis now where we don't have enough staff in schools, we don't have enough qualified staff in schools, and if we're looking at building an economy that's fit for the future with the skills of the future, that's not how you do it. You don't starve our education system of the resources that it needs.
Emma Jones.
Well, we appreciate that negotiations happen. We always look at this from the lens of disruption for small businesses. When Royal Mail strikes happen, businesses that depend on logistics and posting products to businesses, they can go out of business because of this. And I know lots of parents tomorrow are kind of saying they'll be at home with their kids, which means maybe they're not working. So we just always look at this of the disruption to small businesses. And of course, small businesses have had enough challenges over the past 3 years. So this is just another thing that they're having to deal with.
So your attitude is basically sit down and sort it out.
We would love to see it. And I was talking to Mary before the show to say, where does this end? Because we would love to see it. And of course, this happens in the private sector all the time in terms of negotiation and flexibility. Of course, I think everybody would love to see it sorted out. And small businesses do rely on these vital services.
Time Bandit has tweeted, having led the NEU members out on strike, will Dr. Bousted and other NEU officials be losing a day's pay to show solidarity with our underpaid foot soldiers who will be doing that?
Yes, we have set up a scheme, so I will be losing a day's pay for every day of strike action taken by my members.
Glad we've cleared that. That's not the answer you were expecting, I suspect, Time Bandit, whoever you are. Right, we will come to more of your questions in a moment. 0345 6060 973. It's 17 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
20 past 8. Dr. Mary Bousted from the National Education Union is with us. Alicia Kearns, Conservative MP, Rebecca Long-Bailey, Labour MP, and Emma Jones, not an MP, founder of Enterprise Nation. We've got a question coming up, Emma, that you will like, I think. Jake in Orpington is our next caller, though. Hello, Jake.
Hello, yes, thank you. Thank you for taking my call. Boris Johnson, when he says he had an oven ready-made deal, Is that true or is that a lie? Because he said he had an oven ready-made deal.
For Brexit.
And that oven ready-made deal hasn't turned out for a large majority of the population of this country.
Alicia Kearns, it's obviously the third anniversary of us leaving the European Union today. What happened to this oven-ready deal? Have we experienced over the last 3 years what was promised?
I think it's really difficult. I mean, look, there was a deal in that, the first vote, I was elected on the Friday, we were dragged into Parliament on the Sunday, and we were voting on it that week. So there was legislation to be passed and to be done. But do I think Brexit has been able to be a real focus of the government? No, of course it hasn't. We've had a pandemic, we've had all sorts of challenges, we've had a renewed illegal invasion of Ukraine, but there are also some benefits we've seen from Brexit, but also some real pain, and that was always going to come with a divorce. There is no such thing as a divorce where there isn't pain, where there isn't difficulties, where there aren't things you have to get through, and there's still much more progress to be made. The fact that we were only passing legislation on this 2 weeks ago tells you how much further we have to go still.
But why? It is 3 years on. OK, governments always have to juggle things. Yes, there was the pandemic, but isn't 3 years long enough to have done all of this and got it all through?
Ian, we haven't really done anything but pandemic for 2 years. I mean, that is the reality of having been an MP and what we've been voting on. The anti-strike legislation, that was a manifesto promise. We've only just been able to get round to that. The reality is it does take time, and also Brexit, we are still working through things. I'm not going to pretend there aren't enormous challenges with some of it, but we have to face those head on and we have to get on with it.
Do you remember those halcyon days when every day on our television screens we would be treated to the words of Guy Verhofstadt? Well, he's been on LBC today. Have you heard what he said?
Absolute nonsense. You go ahead.
Well, I haven't actually listened to it, but I saw the tweet, and he's basically said that had Brexit not happened, Putin wouldn't have dared to invade Ukraine.
I think he's forgotten slightly that Putin invaded Ukraine in 2014 and that is when it started, and this is why it's called the renewed illegal invasion. Look, if he wants to concoct in his head the idea that Brexit somehow diminished the UK's standing in terms of security and defence, our response has shown that to be absolutely not true. We are the foremost European guarantor of European security, and actually because of Brexit we were able to bring forward sanctions.
But with an army not fit for purpose, as an American general said this week.
So there's no question that we've had to hollow out our military, but
why? I mean, surely if a Conservative government is about anything, it ought to be about defending the sovereignty of the nation, defending His Majesty's realm, if you like. I mean, that is the first duty of any government. And yet your government has reduced the British Army to a point where, according to this general, it's incapable of defending the nation.
So if he wants to talk about actual army numbers, that's slightly separate. But the reason we've hollowed out equipment-wise is because we've given it all to Ukraine. And in my perspective, there is no difference between giving that kit to Ukraine and our soldiers are themselves using it. If we have to give them all our tanks, that would be a legitimate reason to stop war spreading further within Europe. In terms of armed forces numbers, there is a big question to be had here about hybrid warfare and the realities of how we're going to fight the wars of the future. No one envisioned there being full-on kinetic warfare in Europe. The integrated review is actually relatively accurate in terms of the way it did see things going forward. But there is a major problem for all G7 economies, which is the defence industry is not ready to quickly backfill ammunition, all these different things, because they didn't foresee this level of conflict taking place.
Back to Brexit, Rebecca Long-Bailey. The oven-ready deal was there, according to Boris Johnson. You just had to switch the oven on and cook it, and everything would be brilliant.
Well, we're meant to be in the sunlit uplands now, aren't we? And having a great time. 350 million a week for the NHS, I think it was.
Well, to be fair, they have actually provided more than that. But...
Well, we're in a dire economic situation at the moment. Today, the IMF reported that we were one of the worst countries in the G7 and one of the only countries in the G7 who are likely to face a recession. And of course, that's not all to do with Brexit. It's to do with a whole range of factors, largely stemming from the government's mismanagement of our economy and the diabolical, shambolic plan that Liz Truss rolled out only last year.
The IMF didn't actually mention Brexit as a reason for this.
No, they didn't. I think, but it's certainly a factor to be considered along with the economic mess that we're in. I think we should be engaging with countries across the world, fostering trade partnerships, encouraging investment into our economy, and that just isn't happening on the scale that was promised when we left the European Union. I don't think we're forming the relationships internationally that we should do. In fact, the government that we've got at the moment, I would say, is a laughingstock across the world, and that's quite embarrassing.
True.
I'm afraid it is, Alicia. I'm afraid
the ambassador is grateful for us every single meeting.
How many prime ministers have we been through in the space of only a few months?
That's a different point.
How many scandals have we been involved in?
But on Ukraine, would you not admit on Ukraine that this country has actually led the international response? I mean, obviously with America, but in terms of the European response,
no question.
It's actually been very positive, and that has hopefully, I would say, improved relations with countries that there were difficulties.
Well, certainly, you'd expect nothing less for us to support our allies and to provide humanitarian support and assistance. But at the same time, domestically, we've got, a US official reporting this week that the government's plan for our armed forces wasn't sufficient and that we didn't have a properly resourced armed forces. Under a Labour government, we were investing at least 2.5% of our gross domestic product on our armed forces. We're nowhere near that at the moment, and we're providing support to the Ukraine, which we should be doing rightly, but we need to have a long-term plan to restock and make sure that we're sufficient.
But the shadow cabinet that you were a member of, you wouldn't have committed to 2% of GDP spent on defence. In fact,
I think we did. I think it was in our last manifesto. I can't remember off the top of my head now. 2019 was a long time ago. We tried to block it out.
We can agree on that.
Us out of NATO as well.
Okay, Emma Jones.
Back to Brexit.
Yes, back to
Brexit. So
people are going to think that I'm trying to divert the conversation away from it, but I'm not.
And likewise, I was going to say I'm sorry to keep on banging the small business drum and going back to them, but they are the only constituents I know. And Brexit was another shock for them. So EU trade absolutely went on hold from small businesses when Brexit happened. We are starting to see glimmers of light of it coming back. And this is the thing, and I'm completely aware and hold politicians in huge respect with the massive job that they have to do. But I would say that small business, I'd love to think, is the bright spot of the economy. We had a startup show on Saturday. We had 2,000 startups rock up, and you would have thought in economic conditions like this, when we do see this IMF news and we see redundancies and kind of sadness, would that stop people from doing any kind of activity? Startup rates are still at a record high. Some of that is people keeping hold of the day job and starting a business at nights and weekends, commonly known as a side hustle. But whatever it is that's motivating people to do it, what I have great faith in is the entrepreneurial nature of the British people, which I really hope will see us through these troubling times in which we're in. So will exports increase again? I hope so, because tariffs, customs are becoming easier. Partly because private sector companies are coming up with solutions. So there's a new solution called Customs Clear that's helping small businesses navigate tariffs. There's lots of support available for small businesses to say, let's help you start and grow. So I do keep on coming back to, if we can find bright spots to help negotiations work, to help the economy thrive and prosper, let's please look to small businesses to do it, because they're ready, willing and able to stand up and take on that job.
Mary Bousted.
Well, I was an ardent Remainer, and I remain an ardent Remainer. I think that Brexit is a disaster, and I think that the British public were just lied to in terms of the promises that were made. I was on another programme on a different channel on Sunday. The American ambassador was being interviewed and was asked about the trade deal with England and with Britain, and made it very clear that any trade deal with Britain was a long, long way off. It's not in the foreseeable future. And it seems to me it was always obvious that if you erect trade barriers with your biggest trading partner, then you're going to do damage to your trade. And so I just looked up, I thought we might be asked about Brexit, so I just looked up a few facts. Trading relationship between the UK and the EU has fallen by a third. The Office of Budget Statistics, Office of Budget Responsibility estimates that it will make Britain 4% worse off, and that's £100 billion, which could be spent on schools and hospitals. I mean, and it's made just everyday life for people who want to travel abroad harder.
Has it? I'm going to Germany on Thursday.
Well, I really hope.
And I looked it up. There's no barrier to me going to Germany at all.
No, but there's a barrier to how long you can stay there. There may well be a barrier at the. If you wanted to stay longer, there would be a barrier. If I've done a bit of travelling recently, and the queues at the passport offices, particularly going into countries, are significant. None of this was promised. We were promised that there would be frictionless trade, and that it wouldn't harm trade, and of course, one of the key things about the forecast for growth, actually, you're not quite right when you said nothing to do with Brexit, because one of the reasons
I didn't say it was. I said that the IMF didn't mention Brexit.
Well, they did say that we've got a workforce that one of the reasons why we're not growing is because of a decline in the workforce, and part of that, of course.
But
it's also because of the free. It's also
EU
because of the free
countries
movement of people. Yeah. So, I mean, I just think, Brexit's added £210 to the average household food bill. That affects the poorest families disproportionately. And I think the proof of the pudding is now that in the latest, I looked it up, 54% of the electorate now think it was the wrong decision. It's not going well.
But they're not convinced that rejoining would be the right thing. I mean, you may be right. You may absolutely be right on that. It may be also a generational thing.
Yeah.
But if I'm still here in 10 years' time, maybe we'll
I'm agnostic about that. I'm agnostic about rejoining. What I do want is a much better deal. I do want a much better deal. And I don't accept that we've had so many other things to do, because this was a decision where the British people were given grand promises which have clearly not been fulfilled. And I do think you have to be very careful about making promises that you don't keep to the electorate on an issue which is so fundamental to their health, wealth and well-being.
OK, we will move on. 0345 6060973. We've got several other important questions to cover in the next half an hour with our panel. It's 8:32. Let's get the latest news headlines on LBC with Charlotte Morgan.
Downing Street says tomorrow's mass walkouts will prove very difficult for the country. The Prime Minister's spokesman says strikes by civil servants, teachers and train drivers will cause significant disruption. Police chiefs have promised to acknowledge mistakes after a report into the Hillsborough disaster. Forces in England and Wales have set out long-awaited reforms after errors made following the stadium crash in 1989. A witness who police say could prove key in the disappearance of Nicola Bulley has now been traced. Officers in Lancashire put out an appeal suggesting a dog walker may have seen something before the mother of two went missing on Friday. LBC weather: rain for much of the north tomorrow, dry and bright in the south but cloudy by the afternoon and a high of 10 Celsius.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
25 to 9 on LBC. Mary Bousted, Alicia Kearns, Rebecca Long-Bailey and Emma Jones with us answering your questions. Still time to get a question in if you'd like to give us a call, 0345 6060 973. James in Gillingham as opposed to Gillingham. Hello, James.
Hello, Iain. I've spoken to you before. I've been politely asked to keep it as brief as I can. I'm one of the nearly 4 million small business owners, freelancers, entrepreneurs who were basically abandoned by the government during the pandemic, got no financial support at all, having paid tax for 25 years or so. I just wanted to ask the panel what they think about that, and also how important they think we are to the economy. We were completely left to rot by the Conservatives. Thank you.
Emma Jones from Enterprise Nation, I imagine you have views.
Well, and I was going to say, and first of all, how important are you to the UK economy? I'm the worst person to ask on this. You're absolutely vital. And James, I'd love to know, are you still in business?
I am. I had to sell machinery. I had to take a loan out, which I'm still paying off. Do you mind very briefly, while I watched everyone else around me getting grants, some more than they needed? It was an absolute national disgrace,
And my view on that, and actually during that time, I spent time on the airwaves with Iain because we were running something called Business Hour, where we had lots of callers like you calling in saying, where will I get my money from? My view on that was, and this feels like a long time ago, is that when our now Prime Minister was then Chancellor, and he, of course, his first response was to announce the furlough scheme because his first reaction was, let's safeguard employees. Then very quickly it was the self-employment income support scheme, which was to support those who were self-employed. And James, the toughest thing, which I know felt and still feels very unfair, is I'm guessing the reason you were excluded is because you're a limited company director who paid yourself in dividends. And of course, that was the cohort for which there wasn't any public support. And so government launched bounce back loans. I don't know if that was the loan that you took out. So government tried, I feel, its best at the time in the situation it was in. And just the view, and again, James, you've probably heard many people say this, the reason why the dividend allocation was very difficult to do is the government couldn't decide between you, who was rightfully paying yourself as a limited company director a dividend, and shareholders who would also have received public money, but just because they were shareholders receiving dividends. And there literally was no way that Treasury and the taxman could figure out the difference between who was getting dividends. So it would have been, and we've seen a lot of misuse of things like the bounce back loan scheme. We would have seen probably huge amounts of misuse if the government had given public money to dividend takers. So I know it was tough. And all I can say is, of course, as a small business owner, you're incredibly important to the economy. And I'm just glad to see that you're still going. So you clearly found a way, as you say, you took out loans, keep making those sales. But I think the government was in a really tough position around how to identify who rightfully deserved the money and maybe who didn't.
I never really bought this argument that the Treasury couldn't find a way, because they did find a way for everybody else. I mean, this was not beyond the wit of man to do, surely.
But you can't find a way, because how do you know if someone's taking dividends, which accountants, and remember, accountants came up for bad grief during this time, because accountants' advice to limited company directors is it's good tax planning, pay yourself small amounts of salary and pay yourself in dividends. But you genuinely can't. Dividend payments are just made as dividends. So how can you tell if you've got a dividend payment from being a shareholder in Unilever as opposed to if you've got your own company? There was just no way of saying, if we give money to everyone who's been receiving dividends.
I run a company. My accountant knows what dividends I pay myself, so surely that could have been released to the Inland Revenue.
But the way it's declared to the Inland Revenue is dividend income. And so, so HMRC doesn't know whether that's dividend income from shares or whether it's dividend income from running your own company. And
but my accountant does.
But HMRC tax returns, that's where they get the information. Self-assessment income tax forms is where they get
I think we're in danger of losing all our listeners if we start talking about dividends anymore. Rebecca, it's an interesting dilemma, this, isn't it? Because at the time, I was deluged with people in this situation, the so-called forgotten 3 million, who just couldn't understand why the government was doing a really good job with the furlough programme or whatever, but they felt they were getting nothing out of it.
Well, that's right, and unfortunately, those people are now feeling the repercussions of having to take out large amounts of debt just to sustain themselves through the pandemic. And I seem to remember, foraging back into the depths of my mind, that it wasn't just about people who were paid in dividends. People were also excluded for not having rateable business premises. So if you ran your business from home, for example, you'd have been excluded from a lot of the government support. So there are so many people that are affected by this, from bigger businesses to smaller self-employed people, and they do need government support. And just because the pandemic is now kind of turned a corner, we can't forget that these people do still need support. And I would hope that the Chancellor would outline something in the next budget by way of a support package for them.
Mary?
I don't really know about this.
Alicia?
I agree. I'd like to see business rates cut. That'd be a great way to support these sorts of businesses who want support. So let's bring on that.
How much would that cost? Because the money would have to be found from somewhere else.
So it's all about, if you get it to the right percentage point, actually you see an increase in businesses being produced. And I'm going to embarrass myself, and you're going to then correct me and make it sound much better. It's why I also married an accountant. Good tip.
That's why you married your husband.
Well, because this is not my skill set in any way.
If you'd like to phone in, Mr. Kearns.
Let's not have a domestic on here. But the reality is they have shown that in many countries where you have lower business rates, the fact is that actually the Treasury ends up bringing more money, because it actually acts as an impetus for more people to produce
famous
businesses.
Laffer curve.
Exactly, and they have more confidence and they can make more investments. But 49% of all jobs in my constituency of Rutland and Melton were saved thanks to furlough. I had lots of businesses coming in to talk to me individually to try and get them through. Lots of them were so grateful for the loans that we managed to get them. Dairy farmers didn't get any support at the start of the pandemic. We fought and got each one of them £10,000 within 2 weeks, because milk can't be stored like other products. It goes to waste. There was such innovation and such speed in an utterly horrific situation.
One of the interesting things, I think, that it has been the unemployment, which everyone expected during the pandemic to rocket, and everyone's expected it to go up because of all the other economic difficulties at the moment, and it hasn't. What do we put that down to?
But you know why? There's a lot that's hidden. So, and we've heard lots of this in the media this week, the 50 plus, and anyone who's 50 plus and listening, if you're not in work, please come back. We're doing huge amounts of work on this at the moment.
Jeremy Hunt said, get off the golf course, as if all 50-year-olds
I'm not implying everyone's on the golf course, but we are doing so much work in this area because, to be fair, there are lots of people who were 50 plus who just decided, I've had too much during COVID, I'm just going to take some time out. They are amazing mentors to small business owners because they've got lots of experience. They're brilliant at starting their own businesses because they've got great networks, great business confidence. So actually, the unemployment figures don't cover everyone who is economically inactive. So it didn't cover those maybe who are sick, those who are maybe the 50 plus. And so hopefully we will see, and this is the one thing that we are looking forward to, and I think Department for Work and Pensions is about to launch a big campaign encouraging those who are 50 plus to say, come back into work. And I do think if we can make that happen, there's going to be a big economic boost.
And we do have more people on payroll now than we actually had before the pandemic. The challenge is, when I go around my constituency talking to businesses, that people want more work-life balance. And so they're saying, I only want to do 2 or 3 days, which is absolutely their right to say. But that then brings a challenge, because the employment figures...
You're singing Mary's song here. Teachers would like a bit more work-life balance, wouldn't they, Mary?
Well, so would MPs. But the reality is we were in Parliament voting till gone midnight on Monday night, and we get on with it.
Oh, get the violin out.
Well, it's true.
I think don't go for a sympathy vote from between teachers and MPs. You're not going to win it.
Yeah.
You're just not going to win it.
But I do actually think we shouldn't diminish the reality. My entire family are teachers, all of them, every single one of them, and I'm so grateful for what they do. But they also don't face death threats every single day, panic alarms in every single bedroom.
Well, that's completely unacceptable.
So there is a reality where people want to say, you don't get to have a right to say that it's a really tough job. It is. You don't see your children 3 days a week if you're an MP, often 4 days a week. There is a real reality check here where people don't want to hear this, but actually I think they need to hear it, because this isn't an easy job. And do you know what? Most people, I would never encourage someone to become an MP. You get to change lives, but the cost to you is enormous.
What you're telling us is that you are a masochist.
Yeah. It's mad. But you want to make a difference, and particularly on national security, where I feel like I can. But it is heinous.
Well, talking of national security, that's our next question. It's 8:45.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
It's too fire jets.
It's 8:48 on LBC. We have Mary Bousted with us, Alicia Kearns, Rebecca Long-Bailey and Emma Jones. A text question from Genevieve in Bristol. Why is giving fighter jets to Ukraine different to giving them tanks? Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Well, I think there have been lots of discussions about this, certainly within NATO, about whether it represents an escalation. And I'm not an expert on this. I'm sure Alicia will have a lot more to say about it than I do. But I think we do need to be very careful. And I think as a government, they need to certainly provide the support that Ukraine needs to defend itself, and we've certainly been doing that so far. We need to provide the humanitarian support that Ukraine needs, and that's why the government needs to set out a long-term plan, and they haven't done that as yet. We've been promised one in 2023, and as of this week, I don't think the government had published anything yet. And I think there also needs to be a lot more done in terms of what we can do in the background to try and de-escalate this war and bring peace, and that means looking at the sanctions that we can impose. So, for example, I know that the US looked at imposing sanctions on the weapons supply networks, those networks that involved supplying components that went within Russian weapons and Russian warfare machinery, and it was reported by RUSI that the UK components are also appearing in Russian weaponry. So why is the UK not taking similar sanctions action? And I don't think we've had anything from the government on this in terms of an update as to what action's been taken.
Alicia, let's bring something else into this, because earlier in the programme you said that if it meant sending all of our tanks to Ukraine, you thought that would be a justified thing. We had several texts from people saying I should have intervened on that. One saying, sorry, I've only just tuned in. Did one of your panellists just say that she'd give all of our tanks to Ukraine if it came to it? I hope she has nothing to do with defence.
Well, look, they have a question. We can either try and stop war in Ukraine, which would spread otherwise if Putin was enabled and do well, or we cannot. We can either recognise this as a fight for freedom, for sovereignty, or we cannot. The reality is that for years and years we have enabled Putin and allowed him to play nuclear terrorism with us. We cannot do that anymore. The difference between tanks and jets is actually very small. In terms of the reality of what you're giving kit that allows individuals to protect themselves and to make progress. Between now and April, May, which is the best fighting season, Putin is doing a mass mobilisation. Until now, it's been about 1 Ukrainian soldier for every Russian soldier. That will change to about 3 Russian soldiers for every Ukrainian. That will dramatically change the situation on the ground. So we have now until then to help the Ukrainians get to the best possible negotiating position to make the best possible progress. Now, the complication with jets is that they are highly complex piece of kit. The F-35s that we have in the UK are so advanced, I don't think we could give them to Ukraine. I don't think they'd be able to use them. But the Americans approved last year a massive package for training Ukrainian pilots how to fly their F-16s. The Ukrainians are still flying things that they got given when they got independence from the USSR, so really these are outdated kit. But there are questions like, do they have the platform, do they have the pilots, do they have the runways? But none of these are insurmountable. And what we've shown and seen in Ukraine time and time again is if you want to make it happen, you can. We cannot constantly worry about escalation. There is one person that has been escalating throughout all of this. And if you spend a day looking at the video footage coming out every single day of deaths and rapes and appalling attacks on civilian infrastructure, we have to do everything we can to stop it. If we don't, we will see Putin go for the Balkans. We will see him go beyond this. This is a fight for all of us, and we have to make sure it ends here.
Mary, I know this is not your area of expertise, but do you have a view?
I have a view that what's happening in Ukraine is an abomination, and that what Russia has committed, both in its invasion and in its practices since the invasion, about the routine raping of women, torture, raising its indiscriminate bombing of built-up areas of human habitation, and it is. I mean, war is always horrible, but it seems to me to be particularly vile. I don't know what the difference between giving a fighter jet and giving a tank is.
One of cost, I suspect.
Maybe cost, and maybe some people see that as an escalation. What I do know is that that Ukraine needs to be supported absolutely in repelling this Russian invasion. The Russians were told not to do it. They were told of the consequences of doing it, and they they must not succeed in what they have attempted to do.
Emma, briefly. You'll be grateful.
Well, we had an amazing lady. I mentioned this startup show we ran on Saturday, and we had this amazing lady called Yevhenia, who had a business employing 200 people in the Ukraine, which was a fashion business making fashion for kids. She fled with 3 of her kids. She left 2 of her kids in Ukraine because they had to fight. And she found a home in the UK. So, again, talking about optimism, amazing people who opened their homes in the UK. So she found a home with a previous entrepreneur, and he wrote to me and he said, I've got this incredible woman, Yevhenia, living with me. Can you meet up with her? Anyway, she has an Instagram following of 800,000 people, which was from her business, which of course she had to close down.
That's more than you, Alicia.
By a long way.
Well, I'll happily connect you, but she'd left the business. She had to leave all the stock on the shelving, and she's now helping, through her Instagram following, she's helping Ukrainian women who are still in the Ukraine start and grow their own business. And on Saturday from stage, she said, I've got people who are doing Mexican food, dog grooming, cupcake making. She said the most incredible, again, necessity is the mother of invention, people starting businesses in the midst of all of it. So, as I say, I'm sorry to be the only sole voice of entrepreneurship kind of on this panel, but through misery...
Well done for getting that into a question on fighter jets and tanks.
There we go.
Respect.
There's always a small business angle.
Now, the next question is quite a complicated one, but I'm going to have to ask you all for fairly brief answers because we are nearing the end of the hour. Jonathan is in Hyde in Kent. He says, Suella Braverman says stopping small boat crossings is the key to the Tories being re-elected. Is she right, Alicia?
I think what people want to see is governance that is stable and competent and delivers on how people feel about the services they can access. Small boats matters a lot to many people in many constituencies, but it's definitely not the determining factor in my constituency.
So she's wrong?
Look, I think you can't have one policy that you claim will win the whole election. I just don't buy that. This isn't Brexit where it's seismic. There is a fundamental issue with small boats. We have to deal with it, but different constituencies have different priorities, and this doesn't affect all of them equally like Brexit did.
Mary?
No, it is not. Stopping small boats isn't the key to getting the Tories re-elected. They would have to show some basic economic competence and ability to manage the public realm.
Do you think that elections are basically won on economic offerings, whether people feel they're going to be better off after 4 years under a particular party?
I do. I think it's the economy, stupid. I think that is a really key thing. I also think for Britain, there's something about a sense of fairness. And if people don't feel that they're being treated fairly or they've got a fair chance of doing well for themselves and their family, then that has an effect. And I do think scandal after scandal around tax evasion and bullying and everything else. I mean, I do think that... I think we've got a tired government now, which is coming to the end of its time. When Tory governments start to fail, it's usually because of financial scandals. Labour fail for different sorts of scandals, and that's where we are. We're at the end days of a failing government.
Rebecca Long-Bailey, when you're knocking on doors on the streets of Salford, how often do small boats come up as an issue?
Well, we haven't got a sea border in Salford, so it's not really a major issue.
There's a bit of water in Salford.
We've got a canal and a river. We try and keep people from Manchester out from time to time, but that's about it.
There's nothing wrong with people from Manchester.
Don't start.
But no, I think the important thing for my constituents is whether they're going to be better off under this government or under a Labour government, and they know that 13 years of this government has driven our public services, our local authority budgets and their quality of life into the ground. And people are angry. Even people who voted Conservative at the last election are angry. And I think Mary's tapped into something really important. It's that sense of fairness and fair play. We're a nation that's proud to have always based itself on fairness. And over the past few years, we haven't had a government that's fair. It's treated many of the people that live in my constituency with contempt. It's treating its key workers with contempt.
It loves the people of Manchester.
It doesn't love the people of Manchester. It only loves a very small proportion of society, and unfortunately it's not the majority of my constituents.
Well, I guess if it comes to stopping small boats or supporting small businesses, I'd go with supporting small business.
Right, let's move on to the final question. It's from Michaela in King's Lynn. Gene editing technology is apparently going to allow scientists to bring the dodo back to life. Which public figure would you like to see briefly resurrected through this technology so you can have a chat or dinner with them? Who wants to kick off?
Oh, I'd like Jane Austen.
Oh, really?
I read her, I mean, Pride and Prejudice, Emma, Sense and Sensibility. I just think she was so witty, and I think she's quite reserved as well, so it'd have to be, she liked apple pie, so it'd have to finish with apple pie, but I'd like Jane Austen,
Anyone that likes apple pie is fine by me. Alicia?
It's difficult because literally all I could think of the first minute was my dad. My dad. But maybe Elizabeth I. I'd love to hear what a woman who leaned in, way back then, and also just to understand society, and did we understand history, or Cleopatra, that would be even more.
Did Elizabeth I really have wooden teeth?
There's many questions, but actually Cleopatra, I think even more, really understand that time of society.
Emma?
Can I say Margaret Thatcher?
Oh, no,
I know,
get
this
out.
is the thing. This is because I'm sitting next to Rebecca and I'm like, what reaction
And you were
will
going
this
on so
deliver?
well.
No, I just, for a politician who ran the country like you would run a business, I'd just love to know more about why.
You've done so well in bringing business into every single question.
It's my job.
Rebecca?
Well, I think Clement Attlee, because he rebuilt the country after the war, and I think we're desperately in need of some old-fashioned statesmen and women who put the country first and put people's needs
Just
first.
imagine Clement Attlee working with Margaret Thatcher. Wouldn't that be something? Thank you all very much indeed for taking part in our show tonight. To Alicia, to Mary, to Rebecca and to Emma. Right, we'll have another cross question for you tomorrow at 8, but coming up in the next hour, we're going to approach a difficult subject. Children are being exposed to online pornography from as young as 9 years old, according to a study for the Children's Commissioner for England. A quarter of 16 to 21-year-olds first saw pornography on the internet while still at primary school. By the age of 13, 50% had been exposed to it. Now, that was not the case years ago for obvious reasons. if you know that your child has viewed pornography, what have you done about it? What can a parent do? And what effect can pornography have on a young mind? 0345 6060 973. Never say we don't tackle the difficult subjects on this show.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, the government says it expects significant disruption from various strikes tomorrow. 600 military personnel will support public services as a result of walkouts. Civil servants, teachers in England and Wales and train drivers are all taking action over pay, jobs and conditions. The Education Secretary suggested they won't discuss pay, but Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union, Dr Mary Bousted, has told Cross Question it's in their interest to do so.
Teachers are teaching out of their subject area. That's happening on an industrial scale now. Rishi Sunak
To be fair,
says,
that's always happened.
well, it's much worse now.
I can remember it happened when I was at school.
But it's much worse now. 500,000 children regularly being taught by teachers who are not qualified in the subject they're teaching, and that's getting worse. So we do need to discuss all these things. But actually, the trade dispute is about pay, and this government has to come to the table and begin negotiations with serious negotiators, because we hope that tomorrow's day of strike action will be the last day of strike action.
Police forces have apologised for profound failings 34 years on from the Hillsborough disaster. The National Police Chiefs Council has responded to a report which was carried out in 2017. Michel Barnier has told LBC Britain's decision to leave the single market has exacerbated the country's economic slowdown. The International Monetary Fund's predicting the UK's economy will perform worse than any other advanced nation. On the